This is the audio presentation for Communism in Vietnam. Anytime I'm about to change slides, I will say next slide. And let's get into it. Next slide. Control. France laid claim to the land area known as Indochina, which is now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, in the early 1900s. Japan took control of Indochina during World War II, but after Japan's defeat, France wanted to regain control. Next slide. This is a picture of the area known as French Indochina. So you see all these different places. Now, they have different names, French names, but this is the general area. Next slide. Nationalism. The people who lived in Indochina resisted French control. They resented being treated like second-class citizens in their own country. Soon, Vietnamese nationalism arose under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. Notice the second-class citizen thing again, and nationalism as a response. It's something that we saw with India. Next slide. Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh believed that the Communist Party was the way to go because they often spoke against European colonial powers. Minh's views became popular among the people, and he began to stage protests against the French. On September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence from France, even though France refused to give up control. Next slide. This is a picture of a young Ho Chi Minh back when he was an Indochinese delegate to the French Communist Congress in 1921. Oh, sorry, next slide. The Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh created the Viet Minh League, a guerrilla army to fight against the French. The Viet Minh received assistance from China and the Soviet Union. For 8 years, the Viet Minh fought the French troops in what is now known as the First Indochina War. So when they say guerrilla army, they mean that they're going to fight not straight up battles. They're going to do a lot of sneak attacks and things like that. Also notice the Viet Minh are receiving assistance from China and the Soviet Union, the two major communist powers in the world. Next slide. That's another picture of Ho Chi Minh with some of his Viet Minh soldiers, and this is in 1950. And this is a picture of Viet Minh soldiers resting in a trench between advances, so in between charges and things like that. They would hunker down and kind of rest for a few minutes before they had to go and attack again. Next slide. Independence. In 1954, France surrendered and finally agreed to negotiate Vietnam's independence. Ho Chi Minh wanted control of all of Vietnam. However, the United States opposed this because Minh favored communism. A compromise was eventually reached and the country was divided into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Next slide. This is the Viet Minh obviously celebrating after French surrender. And this is the French troops leaving, and you can see the French troops in the trucks and the Viet Minh soldiers basically walking into the capital city of Hanoi. Next slide. The 17th parallel. Vietnam was split into two parts at the 17th parallel. The plan was to keep Vietnam split until the country was stabilized, and then to let the people vote on what kind of government they wanted. Ho Chi Minh established a communist government in the north and received military support from the Soviet Union. A democratic government was set up in the south, and military training and aid was supplied by the U.S. Important to note here is that as that vote got closer and closer, the United States realized that the countries were going to vote to be communist, and they kind of canceled the vote. So it was a kind of a shady deal by the United States on that one. Next slide. You can see the division here between North and South Vietnam. It's also identifying the capital cities of these two regions. So you have Hanoi in the north and Saigon in the south. Next slide. This is pictures of refugees and things basically leaving after the North and Vietnam were separated. So you had people that wanted to be in the South where it was a little bit more free, a lot more free, not a little bit more. And so they were kind of had to be evacuated. So to keep them safe. Next.